Thank you so much, Sarah, for those opening words. And as I was planning what to say today with reference to the theme disrupting humanitarian narratives, there were many different entry points that I could have taken. And effectively, in pulling together this panel, we were aiming to continue the conversation that we have started through the Refugee Hosts blog series on this theme, on representations of displacement. But rather than restating what I already set out in the introduction to that series, which hopefully some of you have read, and in fact many people in the room have contributed through their own blogs, poetry, soundscapes, etc. I thought that I'd bring together some of the materials which have been produced by the Refugee Hosts project, materials that include interview extracts in particular in this context, given that there are other elements of the project on display as part of the conference space, and also in terms of the different roundtable events that will be included within the conference. So within that context, what I'll focus on today is highlighting the existence of three intersecting mainstream narratives around displacement, and then I'll go on to showcase some of the ways in which we can disrupt this by engaging more critically in refugee agency in these processes. So the first mainstream humanitarian narrative that exists is that refugees are positioned as individual suffering victims who are passive recipients of aid, or as unique ideal refugees, which I've written about extensively, who are truly worthy of international sympathy, assistance and protection. And in positioning these ideal good refugees, there is always the counterpoint and the exclusion of those people who, through this form of epistemic violence, are positioned as unworthy, as bad, as violent as the masses and the threats. So this positioning of the suffering victim or of the passive recipient is characterized by diverse hierarchies of inclusion and exclusion. Only certain bodies matter, only certain voices and experiences matter, and these are framed around gender, age, sexuality, race, ethnicity, religion, amongst other factors. But they also create hierarchies between the refugees who are at the centre of media and political attention, and those who are left in the margins, who are rendered invisible, who are rendered inaudible by virtue of a hierarchy of worth which is geopolitically situated and reproduces this presentist bias. The second intersecting mainstream narrative is that aid is provided to these passive recipients by citizens, organisations, states, UN agencies, etc. And that this externally provided assistance and protection programs are often necessary because of an assumption that there is an inevitable tension that will arise when refugees come to and settle in local communities. There is the assumption that tensions are inevitable, and therefore international projects in particular that would promote social cohesion, for example, are the solution to that problem. So what we have been doing through Refugee Hosts is trying through different media and through different disciplinary entry points to explore how we can document, trace, examine, resist different ways of seeing, knowing, feeling, listening to, writing, reading, drawing, conceptualizing, and otherwise responding to displacement, including through photography, and you have some photo essays on display throughout the conference, which exemplify the provocation which I presented in my introduction to the Representations of Displacement series, to use photography through the lens of spaces and places, not faces, to interrogate what can we achieve by resisting the tendency to humanize the migrant face or the refugee face, and to actually think about how spaces and places could be a more productive approach to representing displacement and to representing the communal elements that transcend that focus or that fetish at times on the individual worthy good refugee. So we've been engaging with these questions through photography, photo essays, a series of photo-poetic reflections, which are included on the postcards that are in your bags. You can read the full set on the Refugee Hosts website as well, which is a combination of photographs that I've taken and Yusuf's responses to those in the form of these postcards that we've produced. Soundscapes, including a number that I've produced, and Tom's, which he'll, I think, refer to in his presentation as well, and in a series of writing workshops which we've been conducting as part of the Refugee Host projects. Now, this has been in conjunction with over 500 semi-structured interviews with refugees who have been displaced from Syria, with members of local communities who are hosting them, with members of non-governmental organisations, UN agencies, etc. It's in conjunction with the participant observation that has been conducted by our members of the team in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey and Germany. It's in conjunction with the diverse multiple entry points that we have used throughout the research project. And what we'll be doing throughout this next year is pulling them all together and seeing how we can make sense of the complexity of these situations through these interdisciplinary reflections. And throughout this process, what I think that has been coming through very strongly as an important way to remedy and contest and resist some of these mainstream narratives is precisely by focusing on relationality in contexts of overlapping displacement. So viewing displacement always in relation rather than in isolation as being one of the key features which we think is very important in this context. So here, I was thinking about which image to use as the holding slide. And this is an image of a building in the Jebel al-Baddawi neighbourhood, which is adjacent to Baddawi Refugee Camp. It was a building that was built by Syrian migrant workers in the early 2000s. It was it was rented by refugees from the Nahr al-Baddawi camp, which was destroyed in 2007, Palestinians who were internally displaced in 2007, and is currently occupied by refugees from Syria. So this is one embodiment, as it were, one reflection of those intersecting contexts of displacement, which I refer to in my work as a process of overlapping displacement. This is a term that I use to reflect on the tempo-spatial relationality of displacement flows and situations in the Middle East in my work, but that is also relevant, I think, around different displacement contexts around the world, which is to say that conflict and displacement never occurs in isolation, and that we need to focus, I think, more on the processes of consecutive and intersecting processes of conflict and displacement, and the implications of displacement being protracted in nature, and of refugees, people who are displaced, primarily living outside of isolated camp spaces. So that imaginary of the isolated camp does not stand in this particular context. So since people are displaced for a long period of time and often share spaces, either in towns, urban areas, non-camp spaces of different forms, or in protracted urban camps, then we have overlapping displacement in multiple senses. Insofar as it's not only the case that individuals, families, collectives, nations experience displacement on multiple occasions in their own lifetimes, as Sarah has already referred to with reference to current fourth, fifth, sixth times of displacement, but also that refugees often become members of the local communities who host subsequent groups of arrivals in displacement. So this notion of overlapping displacement highlights the extent to which refugees were, are, will be hosts, so again the future conditional very much in this context, and equally hosts themselves have histories of displacement. So I think that it's time for us to think more carefully through the implications of these intersecting processes of displacement and hosting for policy and practice, amongst other things. What it means for refugees to be acknowledged as hosts, and what that means to disrupt the boundaries of this binary which is reproduced, especially in policy and programming literature. So as we all know, and this is not exceptional to the Middle East region, but there are very long-standing histories of hosting in the context of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan and Turkey. So both Syrian and Lebanese interviewees in Hamra, for example, recounted personal and family histories of hosting Lebanese people displaced during the Lebanese civil war. 10 out of 30 of our Lebanese interviewees in Hamra had themselves hosted Lebanese who had been displaced in the 2006 invasion of the southern parts of Lebanon and Beirut. 14 out of 30 Syrian interviewees in Hamra had themselves hosted internally displaced people within Syria since 2011. This disrupts our assumption that there are people who are clearly identifiable as refugees or displaced, and that there are clearly identifiable people who are hosts. And this entails shifting the gaze and requiring us to think through refugee-refugee relationality as part of that process of blurring those boundaries and recognising the agency of people who have themselves been displaced, including the processes of refugees hosting other refugees, responding in different ways, whether it is through whether it's through fundraising, for example, and subsequently preparing iftar baskets for all residents who are identified as vulnerable within Baddawi Camp. So these are refugees collecting money, preparing food, and delivering food baskets to other members of the camp, irrespective of their nationality, based on different markers of vulnerability, or whether it's through sharing the space that is cohabited in these contexts. So through this focus on refugees providing support to other refugees, I'll just highlight a few examples from our research. So Syrian refugees supporting Syrians in Hamra arose repeatedly throughout the interviews, whether it's through sharing shelter, becoming involved in organisations which provide assistance to other people who have been displaced, or thinking in the future in terms of what they will do, what people will do when their own situation allows them to not only look after themselves, but also look after other members, care for other members of communities who have been displaced. In the context of Baddawi Camp, which we've already heard a bit about through Professor Baba's engagement with Yusuf Mustafa Qasmiyeh's research, in the case of Baddawi Camp, we have interviews with Kurdish refugees from Syria who indicate that, in fact, due to the precarity of the local community, the precarity of the local residents of Baddawi Camp, they did not necessarily receive extensive assistance from the host community or from local aid organisations, but in fact received assistance and support through other Kurdish families who had been displaced before them. In this case, a Kurdish refugee from Syria interviewed in Baddawi recounts that the people who provided that person with support had themselves been displaced but had arrived 6 months before them. So this is not a long period of time to become established, and yet that family's support for me, I quote, can be summarised in the fact that my family and I were hosted at their house for a full month, and they provided food for us at their personal expense during that period. To recognise this element of refugee-refugee relationality could be explored through these interview extracts, but as we have been doing throughout the research project, it can also be encapsulated and captured in the poetic lines of our writer-in-residence, Yusuf Mustafa Qasmiyeh, who, in Writing the Camp, writes, "Refugees ask other refugees, who are you?" Refugees ask other refugees, "Who are we to come to you, and who are you to come to us?" Nobody answers. Palestinians, Syrians, Iraqis, Kurds share the camp, the same different camp, the camp of a camp. They have all come to re-originate the beginning with their own hands and feet. And again, echoing the words of Professor Baba, the importance of temporality arises repeatedly throughout our interviews, but also through the poetic engagement and analysis of Yusuf throughout our research project. To re-originate the beginning with one's own hands and feet is exemplified by the multiple histories of displacement which have created a camp like Baddawi. Baddawi Camp is currently home to tens of thousands of people from Syria, but it also has multiple histories which have created the camp as it is today. Re-originating the beginning with their own hands and feet in 2007 were the more than 15,000 Palestinian refugees from Nahr al-Badid camp who were internally displaced to and were hosted in Baddawi Camp after the destruction of that camp in 2007. And about 10,000 refugees from Nahr al-Badid now form part of the refugee community in Baddawi who are hosting refugees from Syria. To summarise, these are internally displaced refugees hosted by refugees now hosting refugees, reminding us of the intense precarity in which people live their lives and create meaningful lives as they can, but also the extent to which people respond, and that any history of displacement is always already a history of response. It's a history of hosting. And this is a very important element that needs to be recalled throughout all analyses of displacement, and that is currently erased from view by humanitarian narratives, which remain embedded within a presentist bias and an isolationist framework of responding to today's crisis, rather than thinking through the implications and the extent to which the current situation has been constituted by these histories. So beyond isolated sites or isolated conflicts, what we have been doing throughout Refugee Hosts has been to trace the intersecting and constitutive nature of these localities, of these processes. So to look at Baddawi or to study Baddawi, we cannot do it in isolation. It always needs to be viewed through relation to other spaces and contexts. In our context, in our project, we've been doing that through looking at the relationship between displaced places and displaced people in Lebanon, but also in Jordan and in Turkey. These are personal connections, but there are also particular spaces which have travelled across time and space, which have arisen in or been reborn in the camp, and in so doing have changed and constituted the physical nature of the camp, but also the understanding that Nahr el-Badid camp is not just in the camp, it's not only in Baddawi camp, it is now part of its potential future. It's not just that Al-Yarmouk has arisen again within Baddawi refugee camp, but that the destruction and the siege of Yarmouk camp is the potential future of Baddawi camp. It's to recognise that Tel el-Zatar neighbourhood within Baddawi camp is not simply marked by a flag. It is a reminder that this is the collective history and potentially the collective future of the residents of this space. In essence, each site is intimately related to and constituted through other spaces within Lebanon, but also through diverse transnational spaces, such as the Yarmouk neighbourhood, which is now marking the location of this particular mini-market. Through their symbolic and physical resonance, the destroyed camps of Nahr el-Badid, Yarmouk, and Tel el-Zatar are more than physically within Baddawi camp. They are the history, present, and potential future of Baddawi. This particular interview extract, I think, is a very powerful reminder both of the precarity of many people's lives in displacement, but also of the different ways that refugees respond to support the needs and rights of diverse people affected by conflict and forced migration. And effectively, over the course of 6 years, this individual Palestinian man hosted 5 Palestinian families and subsequently 1 Syrian family in his own home, and was also internally displaced himself and was subsequently hosted by other refugees in Baddawi camp. And I will just read his words now. While I was still in Nahr el-Badid camp, my original place of residence, I hosted 5 Palestinian families displaced from Burj al-Badajna camp in Beirut in 2006 for a whole month. We shared everything with them, the rooms of the house and the food, until they returned to their homes. When we left Nahr el-Badid in 2007, when the camp was physically razed to the ground, the people poured into Baddawi camp in just 1 day, and the people here in Baddawi were waiting for us to lend a helping hand and to help secure shelter for us. In 2012, I hosted a Syrian family in my house for 15 days until I secured them a house of their own. I offered them food, clothes, and necessary supplies during that entire period. This is not a refugee passively awaiting assistance to be provided externally. This is an individual who is simultaneously a refugee, an internally displaced person, a host, who carries multiple histories of displacement and multiple histories of hosting, multiple future conditions as well in that process. Now, in highlighting the ways in which refugees respond to their own situations and those of others is by far not to idealise these responses, but rather to lay the foundations to acknowledge the limits and the unsustainability of local and refugee-led responses. In the words of a Syrian refugee living in Baddawi camp, they argue, the local communities here in Baddawi camp are also in a deplorable situation and also suffer from poverty. They cannot meet their own needs. How can they provide in-kind and financial assistance to others? We ask only for good treatment and non-discrimination between refugees on the basis of their political affiliations. The institutions here are meant to provide assistance, and we would like them to provide assistance in a professional way. Repeatedly, we have been informed of simultaneously the agency of people responding to their own situation and that of others, but also the need for the international community and for national responses to be meaningful, inclusionary, and sustainable. Repeatedly, our interlocutors have held accountable and have tried to hold responsible the actors who are responsible for the displacement and who should be responsible for meaningful response. A Syrian refugee living in Baddawi argued, I think that providing assistance should be limited to government organisations only. As for the local community, the most it can do is to treat displaced people well. and a Palestinian from Nahr el-Bared, resident in Baddawi Camp, it is the responsibility of the United Nations and all organisations and institutions with humanitarian titles, i.e. with the word humanitarian in their title or in their mandate. When the local community is destitute and poor, it is mostly not responsible for offering relief to anyone, and it only has some secondary roles, and this itself is an achievement. I appreciate what the local community has done in relation to the capacities of the others. It is significant work and deserves to be appreciated. And I will echo that. It is significant work. It does deserve to be appreciated. It is an achievement, and it is an achievement in particular because of the situations of precarity in which these individuals, families, communities are living. And this is also a reminder that when we are told that there are inevitable tensions that arise in local communities who are responding, this is to reproduce an ahistorical reading of the situation. It is to reproduce a figure of the camp, a figure of the response in isolation from not only other histories, but also other structures of inequality. The assumption that displacement will be characterised by hierarchies and tensions needs to be disrupted. That assumption is itself, I think, highly problematic, and I have argued elsewhere that hostility and rejection are not inevitable. They are manufactured, they are created by multiple actors, including by national responses, but also by international policies and programmes, even those, or especially those, which are ostensibly developed on behalf of people who have been displaced themselves. It is essential that we contest this notion that tensions, hostility, and hierarchies are inevitable, and rather we must analyse the situations through multi-scalar analysis, which is attentive to time and space, which is attentive to the intersecting structures of inequality and oppression, which frame the lived experiences and the lived responses of displaced people, and of course also the deaths and the afterlives of those people and of the spaces that have been inhabited and subsequently often razed to the ground in these processes. So as I am about to conclude, some of the tensions which have been created within Baddawi Camp include the following: state policies and the policies of exclusion and discrimination which have been created by the states which have been hosting refugees, are often at the core of the tensions which arise within hosting communities, whether these are communities of citizens, refugees, or a combination of those. In a context like Baddawi Camp, which is a Palestinian camp, which had originally been home, as it were, to UNRWA policies and programmes, the UN relief and works agencies, which respond to the needs and rights of Palestinians in its areas of operation. This space is no longer solely the remit of UNRWA, but has also been what I've called UNHCRized. It's become a space which is home to both UNHCR and UNRWA programmes. UNHCR, by virtue of its policies, responding to all refugees except for Palestinians, and UNRWA responding only to Palestinians, have created hierarchies and tensions through a bifurcated system of policies and programmes. Assistance has been determined on nationality and the date of arrival rather than on the basis of needs and rights. It has created visible differences in terms of being able to identify, for example, whether a child going to school at a particular time of the day is Syrian or Palestinian, simply by virtue of knowing what time the school doors open for a Lebanese school or an UNRWA-run school. It's a system which has created a reduction of the number of professionals working in UNRWA schools because UNHCR has been providing higher salaries for people, which mean that the professional services, the medical systems, the educational systems for Palestinians have been deteriorating because professionals have moved over to UNHCR projects for that very logical reason of wanting to receive a higher salary and be able to support their own families. But there are also examples of international programmes leading to tensions in other ways, in ways that are potentially counterintuitive to those organisations which argue that cash in hand or voucher systems lead to enhanced self-reliance amongst refugees. So here, a Palestinian from Baddawi Camp reminds us of the tensions that were created when the UN system decided to introduce vouchers in the camp. When the international institutions assumed responsibility for the Syrians and provided them with vouchers to buy things, one of their conditions was that they must be spent outside the camp, where the aid providers had exclusively contracted big institutions, and the camp's businesses returned to recession again. Tensions are not organic, they are not inevitable, they are not natural. They are created through the creation of the institutionalization of hierarchies of worth, of bifurcated systems of assistance, and this must be addressed moving forward. So in conclusion, and hopefully not too far over my time allocation, displacement must be viewed and analysed as in relation to other situations. Displacement situations intersect. They are not situations that exist or arise in isolation. They are embedded within temporal, spatial, and material intersections and overlaps. Refugees are, were, will be hosts, and vice versa. We need to either use the term refugee hosts, which is a potential, or we need to lose those terms and, in fact, rethink the vocabulary that we use in a way that recognises the multiple positionalities and the agency of all people involved in and responding to displacement in these processes. It's often artificial to distinguish between refugees and local host communities. So for those of you who work in NGOs, in policy and in practice, think carefully, please, about the terms that are used in the reports, which seem to create these two silos of refugees on the one hand and local communities on the other. These are intersecting and mutually constitutive. And finally, tensions and hostility are created, are manufactured through politics, policies and programmes, and through exclusionary modes of representation as well. Thank you very much.